Praised be Jesus and Mary. Good afternoon, fellow classmates, and good afternoon, Dr. Aida Patron. I am Romeo Jr. Ibihar, and this afternoon, I will be discussing with you the standards of validation and evaluation. Here is the order of my presentation. Number 1, validation, which includes its definition, types of validation, frames of validation, criteria, and strategies. And number 2, evaluation, which includes its definition, standards, criteria, and criteria in evaluating the quality of different types of qualitative research. Let me start my discussion with validation and its definition. According to Creswell and Poth in 2013, validation is trying to assess the accuracy of the results as best described by the researcher, the participants, and the readers. This indicates that any report of research is a representation by the author. Lather in 1991 identifies 4 types of validation. Number 1, triangulation, where multiple data sources, methods, and theoretical schemes are considered. Number 2, construct validation. It recognizes the constructs that exist rather than imposing theories or constructs on informants or the context. Number 3, face validation, described by J. Kidder in 1982 as a click of recognition and a yes of course instead of yes but experience. And number 4, catalytic validation, which energizes participants toward knowing reality to transform it. Angen in 2000 advances 2 types of validation: ethical validation and substantive validation. Ethical validation means that all research agendas must question their underlying moral assumptions, their political and ethical implications, and the equitable treatment of diverse voices. It also requires research to provide some practical answers to questions. Our research should also have a generative promise and raise new possibilities, open up new questions, and stimulate new dialogue. Our research must have transformative value leading to action and change. Our research should also provide non-dogmatic answers to the questions we pose. Substantive validation, on the other hand, means understanding one's own topic, understandings derived from other sources, and the documentation of this process in the written study. Self-reflection contributes to the validation of the work. The researcher, as a socio-historical interpreter, interacts with the subject matter to co-create the interpretations derived. Understandings derived from previous research give substance to the inquiry. Interpretive research also is a chain of interpretations that must be documented for others to judge the trustworthiness of the meanings arrived at in the end. Written accounts must resonate with their intended audiences and must be compelling, powerful, and convincing. Lather in 1993 suggests 4 frames of validation. The first, ironic validation, is where the researcher presents truth as a problem. The second, paralogic validation, is concerned with undecidables, limits, paradoxes, and complexities, a movement away from theorizing things and toward providing direct exposure to other voices in an almost unmediated way. The third, rhizomatic validation, pertains to questioning proliferations, crossings, and overlaps without underlying structures or deeply rooted connections. The researcher also questions taxonomies, constructs, and interconnected networks whereby the reader jumps from one assemblage to another and consequently moves from judgment to understanding. And the fourth type is situated, embodied, or voluptuous validation, which means that the researcher sets out to understand more than one can know and to write toward what one does not understand. Whittemore, Chase, and Mandle in 2001 extract from their studies key validation criteria. They find four primary criteria. Number one, credibility. It answers the question, are the results an accurate interpretation of the participants' meaning? Number two, authenticity. It answers the question, are different voices heard? Number three, criticality. It answers the question, is there a critical appraisal of all aspects of the research? And lastly, integrity, which answers the question, are the investigators self-critical? Creswell and Miller in 2000 focus on 8 strategies that are frequently used by qualitative researchers. Prolonged engagement and persistent observation in the field include building trust with participants, learning the culture, and checking for misinformation that stems from distortions introduced by the researcher or informants. In the field, the researcher makes decisions about what is salient to study, relevant to the purpose of the study, and of interest for focus. Fetterman in 2010 contends that participant observation requires close, long-term contact with the people under study. In triangulation, researchers make use of multiple and different sources, methods, investigators, and theories to provide corroborating evidence. Typically, this process involves corroborating evidence from different sources to shed light on a theme or perspective. When qualitative research locate evidence to document a code or theme in different sources of data, they are triangulating information and providing validity to their findings. Peer review or debriefing provides an external check of the research process, much in the same spirit as inter-rater reliability in quantitative research. Lincoln and Guba define the role of the peer debriefer as a devil's advocate, an individual who keeps the researcher honest, asks hard questions about methods, meanings, and interpretations, and provides the researchers with the opportunity for catharsis by sympathetically listening to the researcher's feeling. This reviewer may be a peer, and both the peer and the researcher keep written accounts of the sessions, called peer debriefing sessions. In negative case analysis, the researcher refines working hypotheses as the inquiry advances in light of negative or disconforming evidence. Not all evidence will fit the pattern of code or theme. It is necessary then to report this negative analysis, and in doing so, the researcher provides a realistic assessment of the phenomenon under study. In real life, not all evidence is either positive or negative. It is some of both. Clarifying researcher bias from the outset of the study is important so that the reader understands the researcher's position and in any biases or assumptions that impact the inquiry. In this clarification, the researcher comments on past experiences, biases, prejudices, and orientations that have likely shaped the interpretation and approach to the study. In member checking, the researcher solicits participants' views of the credibility of the findings and interpretations. This technique is considered to be the most critical technique for establishing credibility. This approach involves taking data, analysis, interpretations, and conclusions back to participants so that they can judge the accuracy and credibility of the account. Participants should play a major role directing as well as acting in case study research. They should be asked to examine rough drafts of the researcher's work and to provide alternative language, critical observations, or interpretations. Rich, thick description allows readers to make decisions regarding transferability because the writer describes in detail the participants or setting under study. With such detailed description, the researcher enables readers to transfer information to other settings and to determine whether the findings can be transferred because of shared characteristics. Thick description means that the researcher provides details when describing a case or when writing a theme. A description is rich if it provides abundant, interconnected details. Detail can emerge through physical description, movement description, and activity description. It can also involve describing from the general ideas to the narrow, interconnecting the details, using strong action verbs, and quotes. External audits allow the external consultant, the auditor, to examine both the process and the product of the account, assessing their accuracy. This auditor should have no connection to the study. In assessing the product, the auditor examines whether or not the findings, interpretations, and conclusions are supported by the data. We are done with validation. Now, the next part of my discussion is evaluation. Evaluation involves the systematic collection and analysis of data about a specific program to determine whether it successfully achieves its intended objectives. Lincoln in 1995 identified 8 standards of evaluation. The standards set in the inquiry community such as by guidelines for publication. These guidelines admit that within diverse approaches to research, inquiry communities have developed their own traditions of rigor, communication, and ways of working toward consensus. These guidelines, she also maintains, serve to exclude legitimate research knowledge and social science researchers. The standard of positionality guides interpretive or qualitative research. Drawing on those concerned about standpoint epistemology, this means that the text should display honesty or authenticity about its own stance and about the position of the author. Another standard is under the rubric of community. This standard acknowledges that all research takes place in, is addressed to, and serves the purposes of the community in which it is carried out. Interpretive or qualitative research must give voice to participants so that their voice is not silenced, disengaged, or marginalized. Moreover, this standard requires that alternative or multiple voices be heard in a text. Critical subjectivity as a standard means that the researcher needs to have heightened self-awareness in the research process and create personal and social transformation. This high-quality awareness enables the researcher to understand his or her psychological and emotional states before, during, and after the research experience. High-quality interpretive or qualitative research involves reciprocity between the researcher and those being researched. This standard requires that intense sharing, trust and mutuality exist. The researcher should respect the sacredness of relationships in the research to action continuum. This standard means that the researcher respects the collaborative and egalitarian aspects of research and makes spaces for the lifeways of others. Sharing of the privileges acknowledges that in good qualitative research, researchers share the rewards with persons whose lives they portray. This sharing may be in the form of royalties from books or the sharing of rights to publication. Richardson in 2005 identified four criteria. Number 1, substantive contribution. Number 2, aesthetic merit. Number 3, reflexivity. And number 4, impact. To continue, what standards of evaluation would signal a high-quality narrative study, a phenomenology, a grounded theory study, an ethnography, and a case study? Plummer asserts that 3 sets of questions related to sampling, the sources, and the validation of the account should guide a researcher to a good life history study. Creswell in 2013 looked for the following aspects of a good study. Polkinghorne in 1989 proceeds to identify 5 questions that researchers might ask themselves. In 2013, Creswell standards that he used to assess the quality of a phenomenology would be Strauss and Corbin identify the criteria by which one judges the quality of a grounded theory study. They advance 7 criteria related to the general research process. Sharmas in 2006 reflects on the quality of the theory developed in a grounded theory study. She suggests that grounded theorists look at their theory and ask themselves the following evaluative questions. Spinder's 9 criteria are: Creswell's criteria for a good ethnography would include: Stake provides a rather extensive critic checklist for a case study report and shares 20 criteria for assessing a good case study report. Creswell's criteria for evaluating a good case study would include the following. That concludes my presentation this evening. Again, I am Romeo Jr. Ibihar, a student of Doctor of Philosophy of Education major in Information Technology Integration, saying, to God be the highest glory.